Going live. We are live. Okay, so welcome everyone. Actually, before I get in position here, I'm just gonna press record on here. So this gets the recording too. And thank you for joining us. Hopefully this is working. Please, if you are watching, if anyone's watching, this is kind of a work in progress. Like I mentioned in the email, or if you're one of my subscribers, you might know this. I'm been planning this show for a while. I have my friend Adam on here with me. Can you say your last name?
Poggioli.
Poggioli. Okay. A very Italian name, right?
Yeah.
Sounds quite Italian. And I have to press record here.
Why is it giving us a time lag? What's the video up there?
I think it's just because there's a delay. There's a slight delay. So what people see live is slightly delayed from what we have on here. And I always have really interesting conversations with Adam, and that's why I wanted to bring him on this show. And like I said, I intend to probably move this show from this channel to Knowing the Truth, which is my other channel. So just keep that in mind. But it is going to be an evolving thing, this show, and various interviews that I will likely do in the future with this show. So always best probably place to connect with me is through email, direct communication, and that way wherever it is going to be, then you can be informed. So, but I wanted to bring Adam on, like I said, because we always have really interesting conversations, and usually talking about various health subjects, but I also wanted to mention this paper that Adam just published on his website, which is called creativecoherence.org. So check out creativecoherence.org. And this is a really deep philosophical report. I guess, what do you call it? Paper?
Sure. It's long enough you can go on an ebook or something. I don't know.
Right.
It's a short book. I'm like, I'll read that. It's a really long essay. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll call it a short book.
Yeah, I know. It seems pretty thick. So
yeah, it's like 38-page essay, but
yeah,
I'll probably I'll probably publish it in book format with some other essays next year. Maybe I'm approaching my Uranus opposition astrologically, so I've been waiting to publish. I'm going into that, so now I'm going to focus on writing a lot. I've had a website for a while, but mostly it's just essays and blog entries. I don't have any published physical books, but I'm going to start doing that soon. So.
Yeah, well, this seems like a heavy start to your publishing career. And
ironically, though, this is like my light fare. So I'm publishing cultural critique essays that are interfacing and engaging with pop culture. Whereas after I think I'm going to publish an essay book first with a lot of cultural essays, and then I'll publish a more heavy theory book where I want to get more into the details of philosophy, physics. A little bit more on the heavy theoretical side. Although this does have theory, I try to kind of make it a little more accessible, and that's why I talk a lot about film in the essays, because I like to use film and pop culture as a way of kind of explaining and illustrating ideas.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, this is definitely not my normal type of reading, I would say, but I found, and I'm still reading this. I printed it out. It seems very worthwhile for printing. I don't really like reading on the screen.
Right. Especially something that long.
Yeah. But I like this concept of like anxiety of influence, and it really, just starting to read this, it really got me thinking, because it makes a lot of sense what you're getting into here. Do you want to just say a little intro about this this
Why don't
essay?
you just tell me what you found interesting about anxiety of influence?
Well, the concept of like youthful novelty versus like as we age and as a culture ages, how we kind of lose that novelty, and I think I just found it interesting, just putting the concept of anxiety into it, because we're in a stage of our culture right now where anxiety disorders happen to be one of the most common quote unquote medical disorders. Yet there's, at least in my mind, there's a lot of controversy over whether they are actually an environmental issue that we're facing, that a lot of people don't really realize that it's actually brought on by environmental factors. So the fact, like this concept of this anxiety of having more influences from just like on a personal level, maybe from creating more and more projects in our lifetime, so more wheels turning could create this anxiety effect. And the same thing in our cultural, that's why I found it interesting.
Yeah, there's so many levels you can come at it from. So I'm coming at it more from the term is actually from literary criticism, speaking more about poets and artists that are feeling an anxiety of influence because they want to do something new, and yet, especially in later stages of a medium, they have all these predecessors that have already done everything in a medium, or have done it in a way that makes them feel like they can't do it in any individual new way that would make them stand out, so it ends up. But I'm focusing more on that essay on this guy Oswald Spengler, who had a theory of cultures that they go through like any kind of organism. They go through a life cycle where they have their youthful stages, and then they kind of get decrepit, and their structures and forms ossify, and then it just becomes stale repetition.
Right.
And but I'm kind of critiquing him, saying that there's a path towards greater evolution, and this idea of cultural evolution has been kicked around for a long time. It had pretty naive forms back in the early 20th century, and it got kind of dismissed in the mid 20th century as postmodernism became dominant in cultural theory. People were less naive about progress, and so the idea of cultural evolution was they threw that baby out with the bathwater, I think. Whereas Oswald Spengler was a more conservative guy, and so he thought that progress was always an illusion, and that the only progress was within a cycle that then goes into a descending or degenerate phase. So in the essay, I develop along those lines a few critiques, going into media, specifically film and screen media, and then I go into cultural politics and how this dialectic, or this exchange between conservatives that tend to be skeptical of progress and change, and then liberals that really want change and or tend to fall victim to any new idea that portrays itself as radical and new and it's going to change everything and solve all our problems. And so I kind of try to follow that dialectic, that exchange between these two positions into our current cultural conflict, because I think that is really important right now. We're in the middle of a chaotic time where there's more divisive politics than ever. There's a lot of distrust and anger, especially with this coronavirus and with the mask thing. I'm just seeing so much divisive energy, both in between cultures and between what used to be within what used to be cultures that used to have similar political opinions and cultural beliefs. Now are getting divided along this mask thing and the coronavirus, and so I kind of use, I don't go in this paper into much detail, but I do kind of talk about it in the general on the general level of like why this is happening and at this late stage of our culture, and how we can possibly learn to listen to each other and heal this divide between the liberal and the conservative point of view, and try to have a sense of where our culture can evolve to that isn't extremely skeptical and of any change and paranoid and conspiracy oriented to the point where every potential new idea is thrown out because it's probably going to get co-opted by some elite power group. And then you've got the liberals that just trust science and trust the progressive impulse so much that they don't really look deeply at what actually is being represented by those surface slogans that the left tends to fall for, and it's popular for them anyway.
Maybe some sort of happy medium. Or something where we
well, yeah, sure, there's I would just qualify that by saying, well, moderates are also a problem too. So there's this critique of extremism where certainly if you mean by extremism being extremely emotional and melodramatic in the way you frame conflict, good versus evil, like that, I think definitely needs to be moderated. But we also do need radical change, so I don't think moderate politics is necessarily the answer, but moderating your emotions when you're trying to have a conversation, or when you're looking at the ecosystem of ideas that's out there in this complex society. It is easy for people not only to feel anxiety, but anger and frustration, and project a lot of that onto people that have different opinions as them, and stop listening and trying to understand the complex relationships between all these ideas and cultures and the people that represent them around us.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Well, I'm all for that, and I think I agree. I mean, we definitely need some radical change at this point, and as we've discussed in our various conversations, I think we have a lot of the same viewpoints as far as the mask thing and all these political agendas that are going on right now, and so yeah, I hear you. Which is maybe a good transition into talking a little about what we tend to have more conversations about. Like I've been saying lately, I've been reading a lot about the microbiome and how this concept of viruses has been just played out by the media and just into this firestorm of fear that is really stirring people up into what seems like madness to me. And I really like your perspective on that kind of stuff. So but before we get to that, I wanted to mention that this entire live thing that we're doing here today, and my plans for the show is all wireless free, because as we've discussed in private quite a bit, myself and Adam, we're pretty conservative with our exposure to wireless technology, and so I have this meter here, and we can we can see that the levels here are really low, and that's because this whole studio is all wired. And I want to encourage anyone out there doing a show like this to try to do this kind of stuff, because it's worth the effort, and lowering your overall exposure lowers your cumulative exposure that you get from, if we're going to do this show every week, then it's like just having radiation going through the studio that I've created out of my living room here. It's a lot of people are just not so conscious of like having Wi-Fi and all that kind of stuff that people have just kind of taken for granted. And these are serious environmental exposures that that actually have effects on our immune system, and just like a mask has an effect on our immune system. So I just wanted to take that little aside here, but this is probably too small to actually see in the screen. But I just wanted to encourage anyone out there doing a show, try to do it without wireless stuff. I challenge you. It is possible.
And you can help if they have a question.
Well, of course. I mean, I'm here to help with all that kind of stuff. But it's like a lot of it's just kind of the tech setup stuff. Getting the camera connected to the computer, and I mean, some of it's pretty techy. I'm not really a techie guy, but I figure stuff out when I need to.
Wasn't your website Future Tech Today?
It was. It's not really anymore. I mean, I still own it, but I mean, that's still my parent company. But no, I know, and it was always ironic, because the technology that I've always been into is like old technology, like using harmonic frequencies for various wellness type of effects, and not like what people think of now, of course, as tech. Like nowadays people think of tech as like Silicon Valley startups and stuff, that are pretty much proliferating wireless technology. So
well, we can't let them usurp that important word. Technology has a lot of different meanings.
It's true. I hear you. But I mean, and the reason I changed to having, the brand Health Harmonic is, it has more to do with, it's just more descriptive of really the essence of what I do. So it's not because I wanted to get away from Future Tech Today. It's just that there's a lot of things that Future Tech Today, if you just heard that name, could represent. And whereas Health Harmonic is a little more specific. So,
Why'd you choose Health Harmonic?
It took a long time to come up with that name, and at the time I was changing the name, a lot of the ideas I had were taken, and that one just hit, and I got it. I got the name, so it was like, and it really encompassed what I was doing.
I like it. I'm a big fan of alliteration, so Health Heart Harmonic.
Yeah, me too. That's probably why I was looking at a lot of names with alliteration.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's talk some about viruses and exosomes and
cool. I'm so, even though the world's going to hell, I'm really happy that people like to talk about this now, because I've been interested in it for many years, and finally everyone's like interested in this topic, and it's great, even though the circumstances aren't great. And it's interesting to see that there are a lot of people that are taking a subversive perspective on this issue, and thanks to some doctors that are out there putting their reputation on the line, going against the grain, and I'm happy that they're doing so.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I haven't done a video about it yet, but I'm planning to do a video about the Judy Mikovits books, because at this point I've read both of her books, and I found them to be very interesting, and I think her work is very interesting, but it like some of the other popularized things that are going around in the, I guess, the truth movement these days. I mean, she's one of the people that I think actually understands the ideas of like pleomorphism and exosomes, and but she also really kind of believes in the idea of viruses being the cause of certain conditions.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to start, as far as, you know, because I think at this point there a lot more people out there have this mindset that viruses are a point of contagion, and whereas there's been a lot through history to show that it's a lot more complex than that.
Through history, meaning?
Like influenza, the Spanish flu, and things like that. You know, there's different perspectives on the Spanish flu. Obviously, like things like Arthur Furstenberg, he covered the electromagnetic aspect of the so-called Spanish flu, and you know, it came out at a time when there was some new electrification of the planet. So that's pretty interesting. And then, you know, certain doctors tried to demonstrate contagion and failed. So it's like, so where do we go with, like, is there an influenza virus? You know, probably there is a virus, but does that mean that people that are getting sick, that it's because they've been exposed to a virus? You know, these are big questions, especially for right now.
They are, but I love big questions. So.
Yeah, and just to be clear, neither of us are medical doctors, so this conversation is purely for entertainment purposes only.
Well, I give health advice for my part-time job, and so, but I've always, you know, they've told me, you know, don't give health advice, and medical advice, I should say, don't be, you know, that distinction is important, because for me, I've never been too fond of the model that frames things as you have this disease that has these boundaries around it, and this is a specific thing in itself, and then here's the treatment that's going to cure that whole idea framework doesn't, I think, suit the real underlying conditions very well. And not only that, it can lead to some rather unhealthy approaches, not only to health problems, but it's kind of indicative of our social system in general, the way that, say, capitalism works, the way that every problem, we don't really try to understand it very well, we just try to look at what causes it. And so this idea of cause tends to be reductive, because we look for an enemy, something that we can murder and kill and destroy and hit with some drug or cut it out, but it's not just a medical problem, it's all across the board in our society. We don't really understand our problems, we just tend to put a band-aid on them or move them around geographically. This is one of Karl Marx's points about capitalism, that it does kind of just geographically move problems around. It's that there's an internal contradiction there that doesn't get solved ever. But how do you actually ever really solve a contradiction? Really, it becomes about looking at what are the underlying tensions and problems, and trying to understand them, and by understanding them, you're naturally going to grow those problems into something better, and not try to just get rid of the problem, which is our militant attitude towards everything in our society, and the reason why our society is the way it is. We thrive and make money off of selling people solutions to problems that don't really actually get to the root of the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, in this case, as far as like what we're dealing with right now, it sure seems like a lot of these problems are actually environmental problems, and that gets swept under the viral rug, so to speak. You know, and it's like
environmental though is pretty general.
Pretty general.
So one could say, well, viruses are part of the environment, and so.
True, but when I say environmental, I'm talking like air pollution, electromagnetic pollution, all these potential pollutants, are clearly becoming more of an issue than they have been in the past. Is it related to population growth, industrial growth? I mean, all these are factors. How do those correlate with proliferation of viral growth?
Right.
Because it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? It's like, if we're creating an environment where we're proliferating viral load, then it's like, okay, you can count that virus, but what's the real cause?
So when you ask that question, what's the real cause, you also got to be careful, because then you're following chains backwards in this idea of causal chain, like what caused what. But then, as you were saying, there's this kind of, as I think you were implying, there's this feedback loop. You have this interaction between different factors. I like that word factor because I think it alters the meaning a little bit when you're not just talking about a multiplicity of causes. When you talk about factors, then you're not necessarily implying that anything you consider to be a cause or a factor is the linchpin. It's the actual thing that, if removed, would get rid of the problem. Because where do you ever draw the line? Where's the... So if you get rid of chemical pollution, then how are we going to do all those things that are causing the pollution now? Are those so whenever you're talking about, instead of talking about cause, it's an idea in the philosophy of science to kind of move away from strict linear causality into something that takes to heart other possibilities. What might have been otherwise, right? If you just get rid of something, you have to look at, well, what's going to replace it. If somebody dies from the coronavirus, well, what would they have died if they hadn't got the coronavirus? So instead of just looking at whatever the factor is in this specific instance, well, what's the whole ecosystem of influences that are going on, and how can we change that to make it a better system, rather than, well, what are the most obvious factors or causes? At least with factors, you're thinking, well, it's some kind of point in a system that we can kind of learn to understand the meaning with the relationships. And so, with EMFs, like I would definitely say, they're enough of a problem. I think that I'll use the word cause. It's obviously it's an easy shorthand, but when we do that, we have to think, well, what are the alternatives? Like, is it the only thing? What are we going to do? Are we just going to get rid of all our technology? No, we got to find ways of doing this in a way that creates a more healthy environment, and not just demonize. Because I think you can see how that's a problem with the 5G scenario. Like, everyone's focused in the EMF health community, whatever you call them, skeptical of EMFs. That whole subculture that's now latched on to 5G as being a major factor or cause of illness. But if they just focus on 5G or just focus on specific frequencies, then okay, they shift. They call it something else. They shift the frequencies.
Yeah, I've commented on that on some of my videos too. It's like that people are a lot of these kind of anti-5G people are focusing on this 60 gigahertz thing, but It's like we've got plenty of frequencies that do just as much damage as 60 gigahertz, and the telecoms are claiming they're not even using 60 gigahertz yet. So they're using like 28 gigahertz and some lower frequencies. Potentially, I think there's a higher one too, but they're claiming that they're not using 60 gigahertz yet. So all the people complaining about 60 gigahertz are then just being pushed aside because it's like, no, we're not using that.
Yeah. And even if you got rid of all RF somehow, like magnetic fields, electric fields, those can be potentially damaging. But everything's made out of electromagnetic fields, so you can't be anti-EMF in general. You have to be like, well, what specific conditions of the electromagnetic field are unhealthy? And are those always the case in every situation? With health, you have to really keep in mind, like, stress is actually potentially helpful up to a point, and so what levels of stress are helpful, what levels of stress are not helpful.
Right.
Really, it doesn't have to be that complicated because we have nature as a great example, and the fields that nature produces tend to be pretty healthy, but then there's geopathic stressors too. There's certain arrangements of even a natural environment that might not be healthy. You got to be careful where you. That's the whole idea of feng shui is that, like, just even without any modern technology, keeping in mind the way that the field is shaped. So it's never just a simple causal discussion. You can start with using that word cause, but it should lead into an awareness of relationships and those factors and how they're interacting. And that's something that is both an ancient technology and a future technology, because the Chinese in particular were really good at looking at interrelationships and their whole medical systems based on the analogical relation model. But we need to get to a level where we can kind of translate that into more concrete, specific science, and I think that is one of the main important goals for future technology.
Yeah. So I like the way you describe the whole concept of exosomes and toxicity. Maybe you can get into some of that.
Well, you said you liked it, so
No,
I haven't
like
defined it here. So what?
some of our other
Right,
conversations that we've had about.
What did I say?
That
you
is
paraphrase
a
it?
good question.
I can do it if you don't want to.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but I remember liking it. Because I can get into that too, but I kind of have a different way of explaining it. So I'd like to hear your take on it.
What do you think? What's different about your opinion? You don't remember mine exactly, but
Yeah, I don't.
I know we had a recent discussion about Mikovits. Is that how you say her name?
Yeah.
Judy. Yeah. And so I think at that point I brought up the guy that invented the PCR and got the Nobel Prize, Kary Mullis, and that he also admitted that maybe an abundance of genetic material might be overwhelming to people. And so he was doing that in the context of, he was saying this in the context of the AIDS crisis. So he was famously at the center that HIV caused AIDS. He actually wrote the foreword to Duesberg's book. Duesberg's the famous virologist that was really demonized for critiquing the HIV/AIDS connection. But Mullis got the Nobel Prize for inventing PCR, which is what they were using for AIDS tests, and now they're using it again for the coronavirus.
And he actually specifically said that it should not be used as a diagnostic test. Yeah.
But when he had to come up with his own theory, he wrote the foreword to Duesberg, but he didn't say, well, there might be a connection, but he was kind of pointing out, well, the original people that got it and got HIV in San Francisco were having sex with thousands of people a year, and that and just generally living these unhealthy lifestyles that
Yeah.
Duesberg kind of focused on, and
Toxic drugs.
lots of drugs. Yeah, but he was focused on the viral part, the component, saying, well, if you're getting all this genetic material from all these different people, that can be a strain on the system. It doesn't mean that viruses are either good or bad, or I think it's better to call them exosomes because it puts them in a larger class of molecules that are always being interchanged between cells, and their communication signals. They're not just virus has the word, the concept came out of germ theory, and they've even named it before they ever saw one. And so, yeah, I would like to get away from the term virus, but since it's what most people know, I'll use it. But yeah, it's not that they're either good or bad. They're everything. According to the theorists and philosophers that I'm most influenced by, I like to see everything as one way of putting it is everything is a sign, and so everything is a sign of something else. We use the word factor. It's a similar idea that everything is just part of a network, and it only has meaning within certain subsets of. You're always going to have to make an abstraction and make some kind of framework to think about anything, and so it's a sign. It's just communication. Hey, there's something going on. Your cell gets this exosome, this virus, and how it responds to that, because it is a processing. It is a processing. It's not just a causal mechanism that makes something happen. Just because that virus goes into that cell doesn't mean that cell is then going to explode and then proliferate it. It's an intelligent system that is going to process. It's going to think, well, how many, if it's getting a bunch of viruses, a bunch of exosomes, it's probably going to think, wow, there's a lot of other cells around me that are stressed out and producing these particles. And so it's going to more likely produce them as relay that message.
Yeah.
But it's what's called a distributed system. I think instead of thinking of the immune system as having some kind of firm boundary between self and other, we're made out of other organisms. We're made out of viruses and bacteria. Even our own cells are. Nick Lane suggests that they're actually just a symbiosis of archaea and bacteria. Lynn Margulis came up with the idea that symbiosis was important in cellular evolution, and then now we've this idea that there actually it was the two primordial kinds of life, this archaea and bacteria. Archaea aren't even actually in the same kingdom as bacteria, but they actually merged, and so our mitochondria are bacteria that have been co-opted.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have this whole superorganism that we are that's trying to coordinate how all these organisms, all these micro-level entities interact. So the immune system in that sense is not just trying to keep stuff out, it's trying to organize this constant flow of information that's coming in. Not only there's the genetic component that we can consider that horizontal. With vertical is the genetic component you get from your parents. The horizontal is mostly these exosomes. They're just communication between all life.
The microbiome just in general.
Yeah. Right, the microbiome in general, but the exosomes and the viruses are the things that are actually getting incorporated into our genome. So you have this horizontal and this vertical component of genes being passed down through the generations, and then horizontally between members of a species and even between species.
Right.
And then the microbiome is another part of that, but it's
and yet in the mainstream, this all gets thrown at it's an infection, right? I mean, because that's what they're doing. They're running these PCR tests, and then just saying, oh, this person tested positive, so they're infected. They're a carrier. But it's really it doesn't really mean that anyone, just because they test positive on a PCR, is going to be passing along this genetic material.
And even if they were, like, is it inherently bad? Like,
Exactly.
it's information. It's
signaling.
and it might be important information to know what is your cells kind of want to know what's going on, what genetic materials out there. I should probably get a sample of it. And so there's a kind of EMF guru, Dr. Guy Jack Cruz, that makes the case that because we're one of the few higher organisms that have leaky gut, that actually played a huge role in how fast we evolved, because we were able to sample more viruses that way. They were leaking into our blood more from our gut, and so we were able to rapidly change our genome because we have naturally more leaky guts.
Interesting.
But of course, now we know, like, you get too leaky of a gut, then you're getting too much genetic material leaking into your blood, and it creates this inflammatory state, often autoimmune conditions. All these problems happen. But is no leak what we want? Probably not. Like, you want,
or maybe it's not even possible.
right?
Because, but you know, in general, we hear about the microbiome being this layer between what is external and what is internal, you know, and so obviously, just like the microbiome itself is that transition, or that, you know, potential for any kind of leakage, and maybe it's all intentional, and but it is an interesting concept, because as I've gone through various healing phases in my life, I've definitely noticed, you know, different allergic reactions to foods, and being able to overcome some of those through healing, like basically healing my my microbiome. At least that's what I was intending to do. I think it's all, you know, we all have like a unique situation going on in there, you know, or, you know, with our microbiome, and I think that's why you know, no two people are ever going to really thrive on exactly the same diet, you know.
Yeah. But I like that idea of it being the kind of the membrane. And so instead of having a barrier between self and other, you have to think of this porous membrane, and you have the microbiome all over your skin and the inside of your skin, which is not the inside of your skin, but it's almost like the digestive system is the inner skin, right? And so it's really, you know, thick and coating that, and it's, in a way, it's helping mediate that genetic information, what gets through. And so if you have a healthy microbiome, it's not keeping everything out, but it's it's processing. And it's the same thing with EMFs. Like, ideally, you want to be able to process what's coming in and transform it and metabolize it so that you can use it. And this is a core principle in the internal arts in Chinese medicine. And so you want to be able to, electrically speaking, you want to be conductive, but not too conductive. You want to be semiconductive, actually, is the word that. So semiconductors are used to process information in our technology, right? But if you're too conductive, then you're just gonna, energy just goes right through, and it doesn't get processed correctly and used by the body. And so in Arthur Furstenberg's book, he makes a distinction between people that are really good conductors and really good insulators. And I like to think that the insulators tend to be people that have these thicker membranes, right? I think they tend to have a harder time opening up. They probably get less infections. There's some research that suggests that people that get more infections get less cancer. And I think that the people that have this, they're more insulators, are going to get more cancer but less infections. Whereas these people that are good conductors tend to be the people that are electrosensitive, because they're really open, sensitive, overly sensitive, but they're not able to kind of slow it down and process energy enough, and then they tend to be too open to this genetic material, in the sense that their membranes are too porous, and so they're getting too much from the outside. So you don't want a firm boundary. You want a boundary, and not necessarily a thin boundary or even just a porous boundary. You want a boundary that's processing. And then at every level of your system, you want that intelligent communication going on, so that you're always, every cell is processing information that it's getting, and then relaying that information to all the other signs and factors that it's connected to. And that is health. That is when you're able to process and radiate and distribute energy intelligently. And then you don't even, then a lot of these health factors don't even become as important. You can handle more stress, more EMFs, and it won't be technically stressful. But you need some stress, and that's that concept of hormesis. That it's a Greek word that implies it's just even simple things like exercise. Like a little bit of stress makes you stronger, but you have to kind of, every person's going to be different. How much stress can each person handle? Well, you have to learn. You get stronger by learning how to process the stress of change, of difference, of conflict, on all these levels. And you have to learn to be able to be open and process. And then as you get better at processing, you can be more and more open and get more and more information. But as to bring it back to what we started talking about, most people are way too overwhelmed with so much information, so much energy, both the electromagnetic fields in their environment and just the general signs and symbols of their media environment, and trying to figure out what's going on, who to believe, and all the people that they're having to deal with. And so it's natural now that people are just all on some subconscious level just accepting this new paradigm of like, stay away from me, like seems like it's an expression of this general feeling of anxiety and being overwhelmed with not knowing what to do or who to believe, and better just listen to the authorities and protect yourself. I get that excuse from a lot of people that are just like, well, even if the mask thing isn't technically correct or helpful, like why not? Like why not just be careful? Why not just be safe? And yet it's, I think, destroying at least our little community that we have here in Eugene. It's really affected, any type of community like churches. I think they're people where people regularly go and have a public commons where they can see people's face and talk, and like all that's being threatened right now. And I don't think it's just an innocuous safety measure. It has some definite negative consequences.
I totally agree. Yeah. But getting back to what you were saying before, I like those concepts, and it makes me think of you were talking about semiconductive energetic pathways, and it reminds me of some of the work that I've read from James Oshman. Really cool author. He's done a few books on energy medicine.
Cool.
And just the understanding of the semiconductive nature of our structural collagen framework, our intracellular network is essentially makes up a semiconductive pathway throughout our bodies, and of real, like most organisms have this semiconductive nature throughout their protein networks or their collagen networks, and the interesting thing about that gets into some of the latest stuff about the water pathways that in those tissues. So these fascia that are hydrated, they are again communication pathways where the gelatinous structure of water forms these communication networks.
Right.
And that's a really interesting thing, and the way that ties into this whole exosome thing, I think it's another real interesting topic, because it's kind of those are two different information pathways, communication pathways.
What of the exosomes and then
and just the structured water gel networks through our basically through our extracellular networks.
Right. Yeah. One's a chemical.
I think I said intracellular before. I meant extracellular. But it ties into the intracellular network too.
Well, intra would be between cells, right?
Yeah.
Intercellular would be within the cell. Intra is between.
True.
And
So
extra.
I guess I got that a little.
But extra would be outside of the cell. So
Okay.
I guess they're kind of compatible, right?
Right.
Intra between the cells. It
Yeah.
just emphasizes the extracellular environment between cells, maybe.
Because the way I understand it is that the intercellular is the structural matrix of the basically the structure that holds the organelles in place. These are the what are the networks called? The fibrins, yeah, and the fibrin structures that basically give the cell its structure, and as I recall, those are also semiconductive and network with the semiconductive like intracellular matrix as well. So there's a lot going on there, and that has to do with the water that we're getting from our diet, from our environment, from our water that we're drinking, and it ties into some of these old concepts of living water, like Victor Schauberger kind of stuff, and Rudolf Steiner. You've gotten into that stuff quite a bit,
And again, in the Chinese Taoist internal arts, that kind of water conductivity is important. They don't necessarily think of it in those terms, but a lot of the internal arts are about creating space and all these areas of your body, and so you can think of that as actually allowing water into all these little these micro surface areas, because it's this interfacial water that's on these surfaces, these interfaces, that allows the energy to conduct between different systems. And so you can see as somebody ages, they kind of like dry up in a way and calcify. A lot of that's because the water isn't getting into all those little nooks and crannies, and so that's why in the internal arts and ancient Chinese culture, they stress so much these practices like Qigong, these energy practices, where you're actually trying to expand the areas in all the bodies, especially in the making the fascia semiconductive, and then making space in the joints especially, and then you create space especially in the organs. The organs are really important. When they go, then you're really going downhill. But you have to have space for them. I think a lot of that space gets filled up by water, not in the sense of just being bloated and like someone's retaining water, but it's structured water, because it's not just being retained in some excessive way. It's actually getting filled into these spaces that are created by proper posture and energy conduction. And so as you do these internal arts practices, you're allowing that energy to flow in to that space, and then the water that's there gets structured by the energy. So I think there can be too much emphasis sometimes on structured water. Your water's going, drinking structured water. I mean, I always stir my water, I do that, but the water's going to get structured more or less depending on how well the energy is flowing in your body. If it's not flowing well into an area, then it's not going to get structured well, even if you're drinking some fancy, like, super duper techno-structured water. It's not going to get into the places it needs to go if you're not actually creating that space and that energy framework within your body.
Yeah, but that's like the so-called fourth phase of water, that water gel.
Yeah, and in Taoism, it's actually a gel within there. Like your knees will go bad when you get old, but if you're doing good internal arts, it is like a cushion on your that is this. It's nothing, not some special fluid or anything. It is basically just probably these few layers of structured water, just all in the right nooks and crannies that create this cushion, so that you're not putting the pressure on all these joints and organs that wears them down. So it is just about this gel, just being able to be the medium of connection between all these other different systems.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that with respect to, like, they say that hyaluronic acid is like the gel that holds a lot of that water, at least in some nutritional circles. That's what they say, is that the hyaluronic acid is what is holding that water and retaining that gel state. Yet there's other schools that are just saying it's the so-called fourth state of water in a gelatinous state. So
yeah, I think it's both. I mean, hyaluronic acid's interesting. It's probably really important in your joints, especially, and I think they found it in those tentatively associated with acupuncture channels. I think they're called the Korean guy, Baoyong channel, something like, I forget how to say it, but there's these little micro vesicles that they're one of the contenders for like acupuncture channels. They're probably somewhat related, and they found hyaluronic acid within those vesicles, along with some genetic material too, and so people have speculated that there's like a biophoton network along those as well. But yeah, as you said, there's the electromagnetic communication channels, and then there's the chemical channels, and I think they serve different functions, but water is mediating all of them, and it might be tied up in different molecules, but it's hard to just separate it out and say, oh, because water and proteins and lipids are always interacting, and sugars, and so it's not, whatever the substance it might be a part of, it's less important than the water itself, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially if you're just taking hyaluronic acid thinking that that's going to save you. Well, again, like I said, it might help, but
it might not get where it needs to go.
You need the structure of the energy in your body to be forming these molecules into the right position so that they can conduct.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a fun conversation. We've kind of gone in a lot of different directions. So is there anything you'd want to share in closing? No. Well, I can say check out Adam's website, creativecoherence.org, and check out his very deep essay.
Sorry. Try to make it accessible.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I didn't mean that in a bad way. but it's pretty heavy. It's pretty heavy. Yeah. So did you do a summary of it?
There's an abstract on. So on my website, there's a PDF link, and it'll go to academia.edu. And there's an abstract there, if you a paragraph abstract.
But they make you have to pay for that. No. Oh, really? They tried to get me to pay.
There's a premium service, but
I know, I had to keep clicking away from that. So, okay, well, maybe you can find that, and even though I didn't find it, but I'm going to try again. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I haven't read the entire thing yet because I just got it the other day. But I intend to, and I find it very interesting, even though it's not like my normal health-related reading. It's kind of more philosophical.
But yeah, it gets into the current cultural conflict that I think is about health at this point. So towards the end, I do kind of talk about how biopolitics, which is a way of just referring to it. Politics, it's about biology, which I think has been important for a long time, but it's gotten so crucially important this past few months. And I think it's really brought to the surface some deep divisions in our culture. And so I'm talking about it on a more general level there, but I think that biopolitics and these ideas that we're talking about here, as far as health goes, are becoming like the central issue in politics. So I think it's important to see the kind of roots of these different cultural divides and why certain people are believing science or questioning science, which is not really what's going on. It's different scientists with different ideas, but that's the way it's getting framed. And so if you really want to even be open to understanding different scientific ideas and being able to judge it for yourself, you first have to even be open to criticizing mainstream science, which is it's difficult to do if you don't understand like why there is this cultural divide. I think people tend to just emotionally gravitate towards one authority or another without really thinking through the potentials and perspectives on each side.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit before we close out, because I find that very interesting. I like what we were talking about earlier, just about like the layering that's going on and the way science is getting kind of pigeonholed in different ways that tend to discredit a lot of potentially important considerations. I think you have some interesting things to say on that level.
It's a big topic. I don't know.
Yeah.
Start getting into it, but yeah.
Well, we can just touch on it, just whatever comes to mind in that level.
What specifically?
Well, like the truth movement. It just like the way it's been kind of marginalized and chopped up to the point where it almost seems like there's nothing bridging people that aren't already there into being more conscious of what's really going on. Like,
yeah, that's kind of what mainly motivates my work and why I do tend to like write in a little more academic styles, because I want to kind of come at conspiracy culture, alternative culture, whatever you want to call it, from a more philosophical angle to show that there's good reason for finding value in some of this stuff. The problem is that so much of the value is enmeshed within a kind of cultural climate that it tends to be people that are more paranoid on the extreme level, and then some people that are rational and reasonable, but maybe don't have the proper context or explain things in a way that can appeal to more skeptical people that are more skeptical of conspiracy theory. And even that word conspiracy theory is a way of dismissing a whole genre. Not even a genre, I mean, it's really just, it's being used in multiple scientific and thought fields to just paint everybody into one conservative conspiracy culture that's being associated with Donald Trump, with even with fascism, because conspiracy theory was a big part of fascist culture, and anti-Semitism, and all these things that are covering over that there is a real alternative way of looking at the world that is inside this, what I may just generally call contemporary spirituality. The New Age is one word that was used for a while. No one ever likes the term. It's more of a pejorative. People call other people at this point.
Right.
But it has a lot of different aspects to it, and some of them are really silly and easy to make fun of. But that doesn't mean even those are without value. I try to just look at all corners of culture and find things that are of value, but then put them in a context that is more refined and can make more sense in connection with things that are more philosophically palpable for educated people. Because with the truth movement, it's like that. It started with 9/11. The whole, at least the truth, has that moniker, and even that's just an interesting conspiracy in itself. Just the way that who decides what is science that's acceptable. Like a lot of people just say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's hard for anybody to. You talk to some people like, no, it's complete BS, and I don't know, like there's certain conspiracies I have a harder time with, like with chemtrails. Like it's harder to really like justify a lot of what people say in the chemtrail community. But it doesn't mean that there's not something there. It doesn't mean that there isn't something going on with that whole phenomenon. But again, because of the way that it's framed, it tends to be easy to pick apart. But with the virus narrative, I think it's becoming a pretty popular alternative position, to the extent that it's being picked up by a lot of, I think, mostly spiritually oriented progressive people and alternative conservative people, and so they're kind of forming a new weird cultural alliance right now because of this lockdown, that they're finding commonalities there, that and whereas the people that are more mainstream liberal, whether they're Republican liberals or Democrat liberals, they're watching TV and listening to the news, and so they're not getting their news off the internet, and so then they make fun of all, like, oh, you trust the scientists? Do you trust the meme that you read on your cousin's Facebook? That's how it's framed, even though it is different media. It's not just memes and experts, it's mainstream news and the whole ecosystem of the internet, which has a lot of, of course, silly memes that aren't very intelligent.
But it also has incredibly intelligent doctors like Dr. Zach Bush, that are really have a clear understanding of a worldly perspective of what's going on, which we don't really see on the mainstream news.
And so your average person's like, well, who do I believe? It's like they don't necessarily have the time to think through all this stuff. They just want to have a reliable source of information. But I'll just say, like, some of these people in the mainstream have a lot of vested interest in the truth that they're advertising and propagandizing. So, granted, people in the alternative also have a vested interest in. It's easy to make a name for yourself if you say something radically different, and so there's also an anxiety of influence in all these aspects of our culture that push people to try to make a name for themselves. But I think it's different. In the alternative, it becomes more about having new ideas and saying something interesting that you haven't heard before, whereas the anxiety of influence in the mainstream tends to be like, well, how can I get a position in the power structure? How can I further my position? And so it tends to be people that are going to come up with ideas, even if they are seemingly new. They're going to have an interest to financial entities. So either, in this case, obviously the pharma, the big pharma and the medical industry in general is just making tons of money off of this whole narrative. And the people that in the alternative that are questioning it, maybe they're getting some more attention, and that's maybe good for their. I know Zach Bush has some product that he sells, but like some people gotta make money, and so I'm not saying there's no vested interest there, but you can tell, like, just looking at these people, who's actually coming up with more interesting ideas, and to me, that's something that I really care about. What's an interesting idea? I'm not sitting there trying to say, what's true? Who do I believe? What's the facts? To me, that is what has created a lot of the division here, is because everyone's like, I got the facts, and the other person's like, no, this is the truth. How about, what's an interesting way to look at all these ideas? Let's just say all the information is a fact. It's just what's out there. How do we look at all of it? Like, how do we interpret the other person's ideas? Like, I find it a lot more interesting to look at the biological system to think in terms of systems, but also the system of media too, and be like, how are all these ideas playing out? What is a virus? Well, in a lot of ways, a virus is it's a concept. It's an idea that started out of germ theory and got picked up, and it became popular for a lot of financial reasons. And so if we're going to try to like say, well, this concept of exosomes is really important and a more interesting way of looking at it, we're going to have to fight against all these reasons for why virus was the concept that got popularized, and we're going to have to make a good case for why, like, thinking in terms, there are ways that viruses contribute to illness. If you get too much genetic information, you get overwhelmed, then it's going to create an inflammatory reaction. But is that the cause of the disease? I don't think so. I think it's communicating in a certain strategy to deal with underlying toxicity. Zach Bush has a phrase, he says, viruses unmask toxicity. I think that's a good way of thinking of it. You're already having a toxic condition in your body, and then you get this virus that has a specific inflammatory strategy that fits right into the functional ecology of your system, and so your body's like, oh yeah, I'm going to go into an inflammatory state, and then I'm going to use this to help detoxify. I mean, I think everybody has had that experience. After you're sick, you tend to feel way better than you did before you were sick. Especially if you're able to resolve that inflammation, which sometimes people have a hard time doing. They get chronic inflammation and they get chronic illness. But this whole idea of acute illness, of infection, isn't necessarily, a bad thing in itself. In fact, as people that get more infections tend to not get cancer for that reason. They're filling that functional niche with some kind of external genetic information, so they don't have to create a cancer to try to fill that niche. But of course, it doesn't mean that it's all good. You should just go, be exposed to as much information as possible. It's, it's always this balancing act of how much change and openness can you handle, and that's the art of living. That's what all organisms are trying to do. They're trying to find an equilibrium within change. They're not trying to stop all change and stop all external information. But if you just, be open to everything, then you're going to be in cellular chaos because you've got so much information coming in. It's going to be hard to organize.
Yeah, cool. Sounds. Yeah, I like it. I like that. It's a good way to close, I think.
Cool. Thanks for asking good questions and talking with me.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me, Adam. And thank you all out there. And we'll see you next time.